So what I thought I'd do when I was talking to Mark and Tony about what to talk about, I wanted to give you a perspective from sort of another view, another organization where we live in a best-of-breed environment. And so I know here it's pretty much a single-source system in terms of what you use. Not the case in a lot of organizations, although a lot are changing, and I'll talk about that later. But we live in a best-of-breed environment, and I'll talk about how we got there and sort of the cool stuff that happens because of that, and then all the problems that come from that. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about how what our infrastructure is at LVHN, and then the good parts about being in a best-of-breed environment, and then some of the bad stuff, and then some of the impact on the data strategy and how we're trying to optimize systems. And some of it will be similar to efforts that I'm sure you guys are working on. So what's it like living in a best-of-breed world? I think this probably sums it up. So a little bit about LVHN. You can see some of the volume numbers up there in terms of how big we are. The largest level 1 trauma center in the region. Magnet status from the nursing side with, I think, 2 redesignations. And you can see some of the volume numbers. Specific to pediatrics, these are our fiscal year 11. So we're about to end fiscal year 12. So this is a year ago. Just in terms of relative to you guys, you can see sort of the size. Certainly a lot smaller, but fairly busy. In fact, we just got approved for a pediatric residency, and we'll have our first, I think it's 6 residents coming next in 2 months. And then just some of the awards that my CIO and CMO tells me we have to put up every time so that you can see how great we are. And so just a couple things of note. We've been on the most wired and most wireless list for most of the past 10 years. So that's something that from a tech perspective we're very proud of. And we've been Leapfrog designated for the past, I think, 5 years or so. So no conflict of interest to report. Who knows where that slide's from? Thank you. When I was thinking of none to report, it made me think of None Shall Pass, and that's why for those that remember the movie. So we're predominantly, at least today, a GE house in terms of our main inpatient chassis is Centricity Enterprise. The outpatient EMR is also a GE Centricity product. Interestingly, they talk very little to each other because they were both raised from different origins. So the inpatient side actually came, for those that are old enough to remember, Famous Last Word. It was one of the early systems in the 90s, became IDX and then was purchased by GE. And on a parallel path years ago, GE bought the old Logician EMR, for those that remember that, and turned it into what they call Centricity EMR. So they really, unfortunately for us, don't talk as much as we'd like. And then the rest of the systems pretty much are specialized systems. So the emergency department has T-Systems as its documentation engine. Oncology uses a product called Mosaic, and that's for adult oncology, not for pediatric hem-onc. Critical care anesthesia uses a product from a company called IMD Soft. It's a product called Medivision, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. And then there's a cast of thousands of niche systems that we have. So our document imaging system is from Highland On-Base. We have other systems for purchasing or OR management, cardiology, PACS, things like that. The other clinical systems are sort of a mixture. So sometimes it's a battle to get them to all work together, but you can always find a way to get it to go. And so whether or not you sort of slam it in or make it look nice, one way or another, it tends to work out. So some of the good that I'll talk about in terms of CPOE, Tony alluded to that, we were fairly early in the game with CPOE starting in 2000 and finishing the hospital in 2005, including closed-loop medication, barcoding, and electronic MAR. Talk about our remote ICU, something that I think we were only able to do because of our best-of-breed approach. And then a couple web-based applications and the clinician portal, which is sort of the backbone for any HIE work. So like I said, we went live with CPOE, and the first unit went live in 2001. We finished in 2005, mandated it in 2006, and that included getting EMAR and barcoding in place. And so, that was something that we had to really, especially since we were the second GE client to do CPOE, we really had to sort of build that ourselves from the ground up. They had given you sort of the base screens, and then we had to do all the work. And so a much different world than today, especially with some of the major vendors like Epic, where they deliver to you what they believe is already best in class and standard of care. And so there's really not a lot of customization. And this whole balance between customization and standardization, I think, really comes out when you live in a best-of-breed world, and I'll get back to that. But we have had significant effect from this, so when you do it right, it works. This is just a graph of potential harmful medication errors. You can see starting back in 2003, when we were probably live on 40% of the units, up until a couple of years ago, and a very significant 80% decrease in terms of harmful med error rates as a result of the closed-loop medication system. In terms of the remote ICU, so we have 3 campuses, and over those 3 campuses we have 190 critical care beds. And so staffing those with attending coverage at night, especially when you don't have a huge residency and no critical care fellowship, is certainly a challenge. And so like some other organizations, we've done this by creating an advanced remote ICU, and it lives off-site from the campuses. And so it operates from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. It has 1 critical care physician in there, 2, sometimes 3 critical care nurses, and then a unit clerk who does a lot of the other work. And they each sit at one of these workstations where you can see there's 10 total screens, and we're able to bring in all the different systems into each of these screens so that they're able to do, let's see if this works. So they're able to do, see if I can do it from here, their orders from here, look at PACS images over here, look at waveforms here. The critical care application is in here in terms of looking at live feeds from the pumps and the monitors. And so they're able to just sort of sit there and get a broad view. And the critical care information system does a lot of real-time alerting. So we're able to put in there certain rules that trigger alerts so that if a blood pressure starts to drop and the heart rate goes up, an alert goes off and tells the physician, you better look at this bed, in the medical ICU, bed 19, and then he can just move all the screens to that bed and see everything that's going on. And then we also have 2-way audio visual, which is the screen, I think, down here, not turned on, where we can actually camera into all of these critical care beds and look at the patient and get to the point where the resolution of the camera is good enough that they can actually count eyelashes on the patient. And plus, since it's 2-way audio, you can talk to the nurse or the resident, even the family if need to, and have these family conferences when you need to have them in the middle of the night. So it's pretty cool. To me, the coolest thing is that this table that it's all on actually goes up and down with just like a fingertip. So it's really on this very cool hydraulic base. And so when the physician's in there, if they're tired, they sit. If they need to stand, they stand, and they raise the whole table. It's very cool. So we've actually been able to demonstrate a reduction in mortality for the sickest patients that are in the critical care units, and they published that, I think, last year in Annals of Internal Medicine. So significant impact from this, again, sort of cobbled together, including the audio-visual part from a bunch of different vendors, and we were able to get significant impact from this. Some of the other good that, when you have sort of the freedom to do what you want, is we've created a bunch of web apps that fill in gaps in our other clinical systems. And so when you're in a single source world, you sort of get what you get, and you have to, one of the trade-offs obviously is that the functionality may not be as advanced in certain modules as other areas. And so when you're not tied into that, you get the ability to sort of build what you want, which is sort of good and bad, because we're able to fully tailor things, although it sort of increases the requests. So once people see that you can build web-based applications, they start asking for other things. In terms of homegrown stuff, we've done oncology ordering because the GE system just is not good at that, to be polite. And we've done like admit orders for our TSU because it's a different unit, and so they can't really use the inpatient ordering system because it's essentially a different facility. And so in order to move those patients quickly, we created a web-based order form. And actually we do our TPN ordering online through this web-based app. So I'll show you a couple examples of that. In terms of third-party applications, we've actually brought in some web-based third-party applications to do our discharge instructions for the patients, as well as the handoff to the accepting physician. Med reconciliation is done through the same third party. And then our clinician portal, which I'll also show you. So the TPN orders get launched off of an intranet resource page that the clinicians can access from the clinical system. So it's one click to here, and then one more click to launch the TPN application. So our TPN production is outsourced to another company, so they get the orders, they create the TPN. We keep the stock TPN on site, but any custom TPN gets outsourced and then shipped in by dinner time so that it could be hung right after dinner. And so we created this web-based application that interfaces some of the demographic data over from the inpatient system, and then has decision support and sort of guides the user through the calculations and what the requirements are and what the suggested elements are that go in there. And then once that's done, it gets the pharmacy reviews that, make sure they agree with the ingredients, and then they sort of click a button and it ships over to the third-party production called CAPS, where they produce the TPN and then send it back. So it's very slick because it sort of is all automated in terms of moving it along, and then they get it automatically and ship us the TPN. The problem is that you can't actually do the orders in the main IS system. You have to go outside of the system. And so the details of the TPN are actually in here as opposed to right in the orders. But it looks very cool and we like it. In terms of other web-based apps, you can see again from the same launch page, the oncology drugs for adults. This is actually our test page because the pediatric oncology ordering is not live because this. So here's one of the downsides. Because we tried to build this ourselves as we did the adult, we just could never get it up to the specs that the pediatric oncologists were comfortable with. There's so much manipulation of the doses, on a day-to-day basis, and then they all cascade to the rest of the regimen. Similar in adults, but just not as precise and not as much custom ordering of the associated medications that go along. So even though that's listed there, that's sort of one of our failures here, that we've been unable to really do a good job of this online pediatric oncology ordering. The adult stuff, again, looks like just sort of a basic built web page where you fill in all the data. There's a bunch of calculators that are put in, and then actually the oncologists have control over creating the backbone to this. So all the menus, all the different choices, they can actually go in and change once they make decisions regarding certain oncology protocols and chemo protocols. Once those are approved, then there are a couple people with administrative rights that can update this. So it's not on the IS team to have to update this clinical information. And you can see it's driven by a lot of drop downs, and then there are automatic calculations done based on the weight that you choose to use, whether it's ideal or dry or current weight. And then here you can see the meds come up, and then once you pick a med, it fills in the dose and then fills in calculates the appropriate dose based on weight. So it works very cool. The adult oncologists love this, and then again, this goes down to pharmacy. They'll then reconcile it and review it, make sure it's okay, and then produce the meds that then come up to the floor. So this is just a reminder that we failed on the pediatric side. The pediatric fail sign. So discharge instructions and med rec, something that everybody's sort of struggling with, how to get good instructions to the patient, how to do med reconciliation from the outside when patients come in, especially when you're dealing with patients that may be outside of the system. So if they're not part of the community of CHOP practices and they're being referred in, then the access to those records are a little more difficult, especially if they're not on the same system. How do you do that? And we face that even more because we have a very high percentage of community-based physicians that are admitting patients all the time. So we used a third party and then customized the hell out of this in order to make it work for us. It's launched from within our clinical system. So this is the Inpatient Centricity Enterprise homepage. And then from the menu, you can either launch the med rec or discharge instructions, or you can view old ones just from a command that comes here. It then launches the web application, which looks like this. Again, this was built with a third party as well as with our input for customization. And it brings in the allergies from the CE system. The home meds are filled out, or at least on the first go-round, by either the nurse in the ED or the admitting physician or the triage physician. And then they have to go through the home med list, fill that in. The next time they come in, it can just be updated because it stays with the patient. It's not time limited. And then you can see there's places to update the home meds. And then you can work through this to do med reconciliation. Again, because it's best of breed, because there's not true integration with the rest of the systems, when you have their list of home meds, you still have to go into the inpatient system and enter all of those. We don't interface the meds over. We just can't, we can't pull that off. So it's a big downside to this. It's a very cool tool, but once you really need to use it to create the inpatient meds, you have to go in and duplicate sort of the work. Once they're in there, though, then you can reconcile them with the home meds, and then when they're ready to leave, you can reconcile that list again. So the meds, when they're in Centricity, will go over to this tool so that you can reconcile. You can bring up a list of inpatient meds and reconcile with what they're going to go home with, but it doesn't go the other way, if that made sense. And then you can just work through this. This is also the tool that builds the discharge instructions, and you can see the different categories in the blue tabs midway down, and you just work through that. It's menu driven, a lot of drop downs, a lot of defaults. It's a way that we've been able to capture some core measure indicators by forcing certain fields to be filled in and mandating that they have to be completed before this form can be completed, and then printed out. And then it's printed out and given to the patient. Even though the meds go in as sort of ordered meds, it goes through a translation engine so that for the patient, it's printed in patient-friendly language. And then we're also able to auto-fax or e-fax that to the PCP so that they can get it at the time of discharge. So a little bit out the portal. Does anyone remember what episode this is from? Come on. Really? What? Who said, was that Tony? Boy, that's a sad commentary that it's that it's me and you that know that episode. It either means we're that old or no one else is as geeky. So I'm sure, everyone's sort of struggling. Tony alluded to the challenge of HIEs and how to get there. A lot of the systems have sort of their own internal ability to share data. I know Epic has the ability to share data among all Epic clients, and since they really don't believe that anyone should be on anything but Epic, they really don't put a lot of effort into sharing with other systems. And then, in terms of Centricity, the GE system, they're sort of several years even behind that, just rolling out now an HIE platform that actually Geisinger's using in order to share data amongst their various Epic clients and non-Epic clients. So it's starting to get out there. And we actually, because we started on looking at this a couple years ago, again, went with a third-party HIE vendor. So now we extract data out of our various systems and put them into the exchange and sort of aggregate them into this portal. So this is sort of just a mock-up. This is actually an earlier version. It's a little different than this, of the home page, where it'll bring in your census, show you your inpatients if you don't have any, none there, and then a work list, recent patients that you looked at. There's some secure messaging functions within this if you choose to use that. When you drill down to an individual patient, you can see it brings in their allergies and their various encounters. You can see the labs will come in, on the left. And so the challenge with this, because we're bringing in disparate systems now, so we're bringing in inpatient data, we're bringing in outpatient data from Centricity EMR. Next up is another deeply implemented EMR in our community, NextGen, that we have a bunch of physicians who are aligned but not employed by LVHN will bring their data in. And then, so when you do that, you have to normalize the data since it's coming from various sources. So another challenge that we had to face was normalizing all this data, and we used just another third-party standardization normalization engine to do that, but the mapping of that just incredibly intense and labor-intensive. And so it's taken us longer than we had anticipated to get all that going, but it's just starting. And in its early form will be view-only, so that you'll be able to look at this data but not really enter anything into the portal. And that'll be our first step. Where we see the use cases for this, and it's probably similar to any type of exchange, is that patients present to the ED, and the ED physician really knows nothing about the patient. So they can either go search through the inpatient system and see if there's anything there. Ideally, we'll be able to launch the portal from within the inpatient system, bring this up, and they'll be able to get a quick overview of meds, the outpatient meds, allergies, the problem list from the EMR, and then a list of encounters throughout the enterprise just to get a glimpse of history. We also see the hospitalists using it for the same reason. And then even the community, especially the specialists who are seeing patients referred to them who may or may not get adequate information sent to them, they'll be able to bring this up. It'll be web accessible, so you'll be able to get at it as long as you have credentials from anywhere and be able to view the patient information. So again, it's really the big challenge here is about normalizing all the data as it comes in. This is just another view of the patient summary, sort of moving down the page, the encounters and the meds, and again, it'll show you the source where it comes from, because you may get allergies from various sources or med lists from various sources. So it's been a challenge putting it together, and I think it's the same challenge that anyone doing an HIE will face, because ultimately, for an HIE to work, you're going to have to go outside your own boundaries anyway and be bringing in data from other systems. And then this is just a lab view. And again, you can see it'll show the source of the lab. You'll be able to launch our PACS viewer from within this. So if you see a PACS image or an image, you'll be able to launch it and bring up the viewer. So we think it'll be pretty cool. All right, so that was sort of the good stuff, right? So what's the downside? So I'm going to go through just some of the downsides, and this is stuff that may or may not resonate with you guys, but it'll sort of give you that perspective of sort of life on the outside. So when you have all these applications, one of the big concerns from the clinicians is having to log into them all. And the idea of, I don't want to memorize 20 different passwords. And so, like a lot of organizations, we've gone with single sign-on. And so we have a single sign-on tool. So this is mine. It's huge because it has a lot of the test systems in it besides. So for most clinicians, there's probably 3 rows of icons where they can launch the inpatient system, the outpatient if they have access to that, the ED system if they want to look at that, critical care, then some of our e-learning tools are launched through here, things like that. So it works well, when it's working. And so it's just one more thing to maintain to keep working. And when you update systems or when things change, often it'll break this SSO link. And then it creates problems because as soon as the clinicians get locked out and they can't log in, you hear about that in seconds, and I'm sure you've all heard that. Plus, there's a challenge of how do you do this remotely, giving them access either through a VPN or other ways to do this remotely. But for the most part, it works, but it's just one more thing to keep up. So the big thing is about interfacing, the systems together, and that's probably the biggest challenge that we have. Building them and then maintaining them is, just several people's jobs full time. It's just they're the interface guys. There's a whole team that just does this, and we created this a little while ago. It's the interface map. So I think it speaks for itself. It's the interface map. So that's what you have to deal with, this is sort of the biggest problem with best of breed, I think, is that. And then there's the other issue of sort of deciding what things to interface, what's worth it, where the juice is worth the squeeze. And there's an issue with prioritization, especially as you start to move towards an HIE, where you're going to be putting data into a central repository that's available to everybody. Do you really need to move data system to system? And so the clinicians, until they start to really realize the benefit of an HIE and this clinician portal, want everything point-to-point interfaced. We'll move that from the cardiac system into my EMR, move it from there into the inpatient system, move it from there into the EKG system, move the X-ray, the radiology studies out of the radiology system and into my EMR, so I don't have to launch the PAC system in order to look at it. So that prioritization actually takes up a lot of time and a lot of discussion, because each one of those interfaces, again, have to be built, and then once they're built, they have to be maintained. And for every physician, their interface is always the most important interface, and they can't do their job without it. And so you have to sort of navigate through that, both politically as well as from a technical standpoint. Workflow issues, again, sort of this moving the data between the systems, moving it between MedRec and the inpatient system into the discharge instructions. It changes the clinician workflow. So now they're in one system to do their orders, then they have to move into the discharge instruction module, the application to do that, and do the MedRec. And so dealing with that workflow and trying to make it as smooth as possible is a challenge, especially because different departments, different specialties will sort of have different workflows, and trying to get the technology to fit that can be a challenge, especially when you're toggling between systems. So I'd love to say that we have great context management, and so when you go between the order system and the ED documentation system, that the patients are always in sync. But I think for those that have tried to work with CCAL and other context management, I think it's more hype than reality in most cases. And we've just had incredible difficulty, at least with the systems we have, getting that context management to work, which means the guys in the ED, when they bring up a patient in one system and then bring it up in T systems and change this patient, have to remember to change this patient so that they don't put orders in on the wrong patient. And it's a constant battle. And probably the two places where we see it the most is the ED and in the remote ICU, where they're bouncing between potentially 190 patients. So big downside for having the various systems and being able to toggle. So I talked a little bit about customization and standardization, and again, just an ongoing battle of we'd like to standardize how things get done, but as you add new systems, especially because you're doing it for certain departments, there's always this desire to customize it specifically for them. And when we started CPOE, especially back in the early 2000s, we would have built any order set for any doctor in order to get them to use the system, because it started out as a voluntary system. And so we had order sets, all over the place. And then as time evolved, we evolved into more standardization for that. So again, that's as much about a culture issue as it is a technology issue, and something that we're sort of wrestling with as we continue to move into the next decade. The other thing that happens is people know that we're best of breed, so they go to some conference and they see some cool tool, and then they come back and think, why can't we just purchase that and slam it right in and interface it to everything else? When you're in a single vendor world, it's much easier to just say no, because this is all we have and that's where our world is. When you're in a best of breed, we're getting bombarded with, I saw this really cool thing, I saw this iPad app or this iPhone app that can do documentation or charge capture, things like that we have to deal with. And then stuff doesn't work. That's probably the biggest bad, and I gave you a couple examples of that. Context management, the PEDS onco stuff doesn't work. And then the issue with providing support in terms of now you have all these systems, so you need that many subject matter experts, people that know the systems inside and out, and then how can you expect your help desk to be able to deal with all of that stuff? So we face a lot of communication breakdowns between users and the help desk. The users will sometimes call and they're not even sure which system they're in. So the help desk can't even go into our knowledge solution and bring up what the potential solutions are until they figure out what system they're in. So you have all this data, you have it in all these different systems. How do you get at it? And that's sort of the challenge we're really facing now. As everyone moves sort of forward in terms of accountable care and value-based care, the need to get at the data and get at it accurately and timely is becoming critical in order to survive. And so, we sort of see it as getting the information into the systems correctly, making sure it goes in the right place, and then getting it out in a standard way. And so this deviates a little, but I think it's sort of an output from sort of the best of breed discussion. And so you really need to be careful about sort of how you structure your data, because you never know how it's going to get used. So just a couple minutes on sort of where we are with this, and probably mostly because I've been intimately involved that I'm going to talk about it. If I wasn't, I probably would have skipped it. But so we sort of have several efforts going on, in terms of, and you guys probably face this also, that patients can register in hundreds of different spots around the institution and out in the community. And how do you standardize how that data gets in? Because if it's not put in the right way, then it's, the classic garbage in and garbage out. And so, when you live sort of up towards the mountains like I do, there are towns that are just like ridiculous names to try and spell for people, like Briningsville and Charlottesville, and so when we look, there's 30 different spellings of these. Even Allentown gets spelled 10 or 12 different ways. And so in the areas where you can type that in, or where the registrar thinks it's faster to just type in than to pick from a list, you wind up getting errors. And then if you start pulling data based on that, now all of a sudden you have inaccurate data. So we're working very hard to sort of standardize all of that, and it's an intense effort to try and figure out how each different area does it. And we're trying to use a lot of lean methodology to work through this and standardize it. Then once it's in, how do you get especially at the clinician level, getting them to put it in the right place? And so even in the EMR, there's various places that you could put data. Some of it'll be drop-down fields that you could put it in, but you may not put it there, and you may put it in your narrative of, where you can type in the HPI or the stuff that you can free text. And now suddenly it's non-extractable. And so when you're trying to report out for quality measures or core measures, even though the clinician has the information in there, if it's not extractable as structured data, it doesn't count. And then it looks like that, your compliance goes down. So we have another initiative where we're trying to work with the clinicians to standardize how they get data in. And again, it's almost a one-on-one type of effort, because once the clinicians are on the EMR, they all sort of discover their own workarounds and their own shortcuts and the way to get through the system. And then in terms of reporting, again, we're moving towards a standard reporting tool. I'm sure you deal with this, that there's access databases like all over the network, that people have created to do this little thing, and you're not sure where they got the data from or what definitions they use or how secure it is, but it lives out somewhere on someone's C drive or their X drive, and then suddenly you're getting reports out of it. And so getting at that, again, sort of standardizing that, especially when you have various systems like we do that they can pull the data from, becomes very challenging. So that's just sort of a little bit on where we are with our data strategy and governance. So lessons learned, it's this balance between, you can really bring in cutting edge solutions. So the critical care stuff that we're doing, we have people from all over the world coming to visit our remote ICU and watch it in action, because it really is pretty amazing. So it facilitates the ability to do this cutting edge stuff, but with it comes all the added work of interfaces, building and maintaining them. And I think the real key is being clear about expectations. Again, in a single vendor world, you can be very clear about the expectations, because this is what you get. And we're actually wrestling with the decision of, do we move towards a single vendor solution and get rid of all these best of breeds? Can we accomplish what we need to from a data and quality and care perspective, continuing to cobble this together, or are we fighting, a losing battle, and ultimately everyone's going to wind up in single vendor solutions? And it's this balance between the integrated data across the continuum of care versus the functionality. If you start with nothing and you go to single vendor, then the users really don't know the difference. For us, one of the things we're wrestling with as we talk about this decision is that for several areas, we're going to take a step back on functionality in order to go to a single source vendor, and is it worth it? So when we have to tell the critical care guys that potentially we're ripping out, this system and going with vendor X, and, it's better for everybody, sucks to be you, but it's better for everyone else, we're going to have to do that with several different departments, and it's a gigantic decision. So it would have been much easier 10 years ago. So I think that decision between best of breed and and single source is a difficult one. I obviously like Woody Allen, since he's such a positive guy. So let me stop there and see if there's any questions either here or remotely. I guess they can ask questions remotely.